merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Thank you all for coming out tonight, and I think as AU people, you really were right to come here tonight, because I thought a long time about writing a book just about this speech from June of '63. It's an amazing event that occurred right here. The school should be so proud of it, and I can see you are. I just want to offer very briefly my thoughts about this, setting this up. I thought the best line in the speech was of general purpose and application. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. That was the 60s. You should think about that when you try to recover what the 60s were about. It was about possibilities, science, everything, the Peace Corps, the moonshot, peace, all possible. But in the midst of all that possibility was the fear people at my age grew up with in the 50s. Bill Clinton grew up with it. What you saw there with the air raid drills. You know, '63 was the year of big fins on cars. We saw they were the Dodges and the DeSotas, and DeSoto, remember that name? And they all had big fins and thin ties, and the music was Motown. The British invasion hadn't come. It was the Ronettes, Be My Baby, my favorite song from that era. And Motown was still dominant. Thin ties, wide fins, and Motown. That's where the mood on campus was in those days. But it was also the residue we lived of fearing there would be a nuclear war. And I'll tell you, and I went to St. Christopher's grade school, and the nuns had us doing just that, hiding under our little desks. The theory was you'd have 15 minutes warning before everything blew up. And I don't know what those desks were supposed to do, but you were hiding under them. And everybody did it. We thought war was inevitable. And coming into the 60s, most of us figured it was just a matter of time. And Marvin will get to that as a reporter at the time. And I have to tell you, as a kid, I was a freshman in '63, you thought it was inevitable. There would be a nuclear war, what Kennedy would call a miscalculation. Something would happen. That both sides were right there on the edge. And the reason was there was a real casus belli we could see come in Berlin. I was just there last week, West Berlin. The sense that we were surrounded by 250,000 Red Army troops who were ready to jump on us. Khrushchev said we're going to deny access to that city. They're going to recognize the DDR, the East German government, the communist government, and we would have to fight them off with nuclear weapons because otherwise we'd lose. And Kennedy would be forced to. He's scared to death. He'd be forced to choose between nuclear war, global nuclear war, and giving up West Berlin, which would have been the most humiliating thing since Munich before World War II. And he knew he couldn't do that. So that's how close he was afraid. Kennedy had this sense that Khrushchev didn't give a damn about the fact that a lot of people in the world would be dead after nuclear exchange. In fact, he met Khrushchev in April of '61. He looked at the guy in the eye and said, what about all these people being killed? And Khrushchev looked back at them and said, so what? That's what he was facing. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed how close it became, but thank God for Khrushchev in that one, because Khrushchev accepted the deal, the under-the-table deal on the Turkish arms, the Jupiter missiles, and saved us all from annihilation. If they hadn't cut that deal under the table, and I think it's the most courageous thing Kennedy did. It wasn't standing up to Khrushchev, it was cutting a deal with him under the table, which would have ruined his career had it gotten out, that he had cut a deal with the Soviets on missiles. And he did it anyway, risked everything. So I think we're on to something here with a day that you're all going to memorialize, more so for being here tonight. I want to ask Marvin about it. When you were here, covering it as a daily news story with a daily deadline, what did it feel like? What did you remember?
Well, I remember that it was a terrific story to begin with. And I had just finished a 3-year assignment in Moscow for CBS. I was there during the Cuban Missile Crisis, from reporting it from a Moscow point of view. And I don't quite agree with your description of Khrushchev. I think that Khrushchev was an emotional man, but a very shrewd man, and essentially a Russian nationalist who wanted to advance Russia's interest. And the interest to him was that Berlin was, he called it, a bone in my throat. And he wanted to get rid of that bone in his throat. And so he risked everything, moving missiles into Cuba, not to attack the United States, but rather to set up a negotiating framework that he would pull out of Cuba, but America had to pull out of West Berlin. The business about the Turkey missiles, the missiles based in Turkey, was something really at the heart of it, totally unimportant, and both sides knew it.
Why did they do it?
But hang on. But from the point of view, of the reporter covering this story, I knew in my gut as a journalist that I was covering something terribly important. And having then heard Kennedy, I felt it was one of the best speeches I'd ever heard in my life. And one of the things that he had in mind, you know, you have back here, building peace for all time, and he used that expression, but that was not really, I think, what he had in mind. He was thinking about much more practical, and I think the word he uses is attainable, parts of an agreement with Russia. For example, if you could set up a hotline, which he talked about in the speech, not using those words, but communication between the two sides. If you could do that, that was the beginning of a process which at that time simply didn't exist. The idea that you could negotiate your way out of what appeared to be irreconcilable differences with the leader of the other side of the world. And Kennedy wanted, and he was gambling here when he said he would stop unilaterally atmospheric nuclear testing, assuming that the Russians thereby would be obliged to do essentially the same thing. And they did. And it could be that they had a deal quietly already. But nevertheless, I think, and at least what I was told at the time, was that this was Kennedy gambling, and he gambled smartly, and he gambled and won. And not only did Kennedy win, but in my judgment, the whole world won. Because by that speech, he established the idea that these two, quote, irreconcilable enemies could negotiate their way toward a better world. And that was the wonderful thing that Kennedy was able to do.
Well, I guess we disagree, because I think it was Berlin, and I think Kennedy was made very clear to him by Khrushchev, through other people, going into the Cuban Missile Crisis, that Khrushchev wanted us out of Berlin, and if we moved on Cuba, he'd be ready to move on Berlin. But if it was a deal over Berlin, why did it never take place?
It never took place because Khrushchev was regarded, and they said this when they kicked him out of power 2 years later, he was regarded as having, I think the word they used, he did a harebrained scheme. I believe that's a direct quote. The Russians who wanted to get rid of Khrushchev as being too reckless, too wild, too nutty, felt that he had created this harebrained scheme of literally bringing the world to the edge of a nuclear war. The Russians were not in any way interested in that. They wanted to build up their society as best they could. And the smart people in the Communist Party, of which there were a couple, and among those people, they wanted very much to avoid a global confrontation with the US, to sound tough, to sound big, but basically to cave at the very end. And by the way, when I did a broadcast at the very end saying that they had caved,
right,
Kennedy called CBS and said, tell that reporter to stop using words like caved.
Well, I know he didn't want to be triumphant, but he did. Khrushchev in his memoir, did you read it, where he said he was, well, what he said.
Did you read it?
Yeah. Well, it was pretty clear. It's in my book. Let me tell you, when he said basically if we had hit his missiles in Cuba, and he had only one or two big ones, as he put it, but the intermediates left, he was going to hit New York, and he said it was about time New York understood what it was like to be under attack in its own country. He was very clearly thinking about the possibility of hitting the United States, and he said so right at the end of his life. Anyway, we'll argue all night. Adam, let's talk about the speech here. What's your sense of this? Because you worked so much with Ted Sorensen, who had so much to do with the construction of what happened here.
Well, one thing, just building on what Marvin was saying about, one thing Ted I know would point out here is not just the substantive things in the speech. He would talk about the eloquence, and I can speak to that in a second, but the initiation of a ban on nuclear tests in the atmosphere, but also the hotline, which was important now, and in real-time communication, it's hard to know this, but during the missile crisis, it took hours for the Soviets and Americans to communicate with one another. And there was a story about a senior Soviet advisor to Khrushchev who said that when the Western Union telegram boy came on a bicycle to pick up the coded telegram, he was worried that he might have had a girlfriend in the neighborhood, and the telegram would never get to it, and he just stopped by, and the telegram would never get there. But the speech, I think it's hard to understand fully the AU speech without understanding Ted's own background. And I should just acknowledge Ted's sister, Ruth, who's here tonight. But Ted was a conscientious objector. He was a pacifist. He was a Unitarian. deeply influenced by the Quaker movement in his early years. And so he brought that to the speech. And I think that that is part of what informed his own sort of idealism and political philosophy, which he applied to his advice on JFK on civil rights, but also on peace. And so that's woven throughout this speech. When I read the speech now, I think about what a courageous speech it was. Having written speeches for President Obama, just sort of having an appreciation for, at the height of the Cold War, for JFK to talk about not, let's re-examine Soviet policies, but let's re-examine our attitude to Soviet policies. Let's re-examine our attitude to freedom here at home, calling out civil rights at the end of the speech. And even going as far in the speech as to pay tribute to the Soviet sacrifice in World War II, which I think is pretty remarkable given the tensions at the time. So it was just sort of going really far rhetorically, I think, to make the case for peace with the Soviets, and then rooting it in some concrete proposals around the hotline and the halt on tests and the initiation of a path to a test ban treaty.
That sounds like a contribution from Ted Sorensen, the idea of acknowledging the Soviet loss. All of our culture, all our movies after World War II were all about how we won the war, Normandy and all that, with little attention to the fact that most of the action and all the divisions were fighting on the Eastern Front. The real losses were on that front, 20 million people.
One point is that Ambassador Llewellyn Thompson was sitting right there with Kennedy during a lot of this.
Do you think he contributed to that?
Absolutely, absolutely. He was the one, I am told, who contributed some of those very sensitive lines about what it is that the Russian people
No nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. That was, Ted must have been proud of that too.
Ted was very proud of that. And I know that one of the things he would often talk about with regards to the speech is, in the White House there's all kinds of clearance processes, and I'm sure they're even more complicated and it's even more of an intense process now than it was in the 60s. But this speech cut through that process. JFK and Ted shared it with very few people. I think they showed it to maybe McNamara and Rusk and Mac Bundy, but they did not have it cleared through the channels in the cabinet agencies that speeches of this sort were normally cleared through. So they were able to get through a lot of this stuff without that sort of hang-up, which often hampers the eloquence of speeches as well.
Bob, let me ask you about, as a teaching tool, this speech. What is it? What does it tell you?
I have an answer for that, but before I do, I'm supposed to make an announcement that I guarantee nobody made in 1963. If you are tweeting, hashtag AUJFK50.
What's the purpose of that announcement? Just kidding. Talk about it as a speech, because I came across this speech when I was writing for one of my early bosses, Frank Moss of Utah, one of the last liberal senators from Utah. And I just used this for a general graduation speech over in Europe for an Army base. And what does it tell? I think it captures a lot of spirit of the times, but what do you think it has in it?
Well, for students, there's three things. It's a hat trick of a speech. I mean, you have three goals, you got a hat trick. This speech, first goal is it's well written. And we can look at it, we can see a structure that's fine for persuasive speech. But there are all kinds of things that Sorensen likes to do. Repetition. Repetition is the secret for power for orators. There's a reason Martin Luther King didn't say, I have a dream one time. He said it about 9 times. When Kennedy says, it makes no sense, it makes no sense, it makes no sense. And he does that throughout the speech, that kind of repetition. That makes it powerful. Antithesis, the ask not what you can do for your country line. Here it's not peace for all time, for our time, but for all time. These are ways of making language memorable. And Sorensen liked to rhyme, which I never realized till I read that. But there's revolution, evolution. There are a couple of times in there where you can just see him sneaking in a rhyme, wondering if anybody will recognize it. They may not recognize it, but they know that it's memorable. But I don't think that's what I point to most. And it's even not the second thing, which is that it had a measurable effect on policy. I mean, it really did create some meaningful change. The big thing is what is vision, is what people have talked about. A vision that is so unusual, not only for that time, but for any president. He did not demonize the enemy. And really, I remember what Chris was talking about. My wife was sitting here, when she was in middle school, they didn't go into the desks. They would go into the hall, open up their lockers, and they had to put their face inside, so when the Russians dropped a nuclear bomb on Long Island, she would survive. And you see that she's still around.
Those are strong lockers. Let me ask you about the other thing about the construction. It seemed like he covered his bases, though. First of all, you're right about the contrapuntal, the style of the great Kennedy assurance and stuff. If we cannot end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. And so the little the back and forth there. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. Sounds like Jerry Brown. And we all breathe the same air, and we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. But then he counterpunched that with the standard Cold War belief we all grew up with, and I think it's accurate. The communist drive to impose their political and economic system on others is the primary cause of world tension today.
He is critical of the ideas, but he does it in a very moderate way for the way that's usually done. You know, the rhetoric in 2012 between Democrats and Republicans is a lot more incendiary than anything that he says about the Russians. It's mostly about their ideas. And having us look at them as people, look how much they've suffered, look at the achievements that they've had. You know, it is, and the idea of negotiating with the enemy. Look how much trouble Hegel got into this year for saying we should talk to Iran. Oh, talk to the enemy.
Gene McCarthy once said, who are we supposed to negotiate with? You negotiate with the enemy. Is he negotiate with?
Right. So that, I think.
By the way, you're right about the rhetoric at the time, and Marvin covered it. The rhetoric was, I remember John Pastore at the Democratic Convention in '64. I was a political junkie when I was 5 years old. And, and he said, and he talked about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was all missold and everything else. But he said, and Lyndon Johnson signed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and not one spiked communist boot moved an inch. It was like war comics, the way we talked. Not one spiked communist boot moved an inch. And they got a big crowd applause. That was the Democratic Party convention. So imagine what they're doing over in Goldwater country at that time. Great stuff. Well, Marvin, tell us about, because you covered it every night, the way they talked and had this speech, how it was so out of sync with that. It was about peace, not war talk.
I think that the American people, and I know for a fact, I truly believe the Russian people as well, did not want war, were frightened by what it is that they had experienced with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The mood of the world was ripe for a sensible statement by an admired leader that why don't we step back from the brink, use our heads, not plunge forward. Let's think about what it is that we're doing. And it's the kind of stuff that Thompson would have told a speechwriter, that Thompson would have directly told the president. The Russians are also people. They also have to eat and they also die. And so there's a way of talking to them and recognize that they too made major contributions to the world, which he says in the speech. And they are a problem now, and we've got to deal with the problem. And he wanted to deal with it step by step, not big stuff, little stuff, step by step, something that Kissinger did in the Middle East years later, that you do it step by step. You do not reach for everything at the same time. Be modest.
That's great, because they're called confidence-building moves. We
That's
gradually,
right.
Churchill, did Ted ever talk to you about Churchill? I only went back to you about the Soviet reaction, but didn't Churchill inspire Kennedy through Macmillan and David Ormsby Gore, the idea that he didn't want to go fight the Soviets like he knew he'd have to fight the Nazis, but he had a different approach, which was you have to begin with small steps, and then the limited nuclear test bench, the atmospheric test bench, needed to be the first step with the Soviet Union. There needed to be at least one treaty we had with the Soviets to get started.
Well, he loved Churchill, and Churchill, of course, was a great model in terms of rhetoric and speechwriting. Ted would often quote one of his favorite lines from Churchill which was from one of Churchill's reports on the war, where Churchill said, "The news from France is very bad," and he thought that was the perfect, concise. It was very Ted-esque because it was very concise, directly to the point. and I think captured his style of speech writing. But I think it's also important to remember the person giving the speech. I mean, for JFK to be giving his speech, in particular, war hero, somebody who'd seen war. And there are lines in the speech that I think are really powerful, that the power of them, though, is lost when you just read it and divorced from thinking about the person who is delivering it and watching him deliver it. For example, this generation of Americans has seen enough, more than enough, of war. And I think that coming from a war hero, the speech had that much more power.
That's what David Armstrong Gore said. I read that. He had his friend and also the British ambassador they'd been social friends during the war. And he said because Kennedy had faced death so many times, not all those. I mean, he had the last rites of our church 3 or 4 times, 4 times I think altogether. He almost died in 49, almost died in 51, almost died in 54, and he certainly almost died when that boat was hit. Let me ask you about the audiences and the way you write a speech. Marvin, I want Marvin to get back to what really happened, but in the intent of the speech writing, Bob, it seems to me that it was addressed to the Russian people? Was it addressed to Khrushchev? Was it addressed to the American Congress, the American people? Well, how many audiences did that speech have?
Well, in a sense, all of them. You have a lot of audiences when you do it, when you write a speech like this. One of them are the people in the seats. You know, I once had the Clinton chief speechwriter once said to me, you know the difference between me and you? I said, what? He said, you care about the people in the seats because you're only writing for Gore. I said, I write for Clinton. We don't care about the people in the seats. We just care about what they're going to see tonight. And so, yeah, there were the people out there in the seats. And I'm sure he was talking to you. But he was also talking to Khrushchev, and he was talking
This is so ironic, Bob.
Congress.
This is so ironic. Gore was the personable guy. And Clinton was the impersonal guy. This doesn't click. Clinton wanted to hug everybody in the room.
That's true.
And meet them personally and give them a little eye contact. Let me ask you about the Russian. I want to ask you about a direct experience here. When you were in Moscow, this is fascinating because you were there, and a big part of the speech was that the key to Khrushchev, let it be broadcast, let it be put in the papers. How was that transpired? How did they get across to the Russian people? This was so unique about the speech.
Well, the Russian people, first of all, had been told that there's going to be a speech, so they knew that it was coming. I'll go back to an earlier point. Everybody was still nervous about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was over, it was resolved, but they wondered if it could happen once, it could happen again. And the Russian people had at that time, they still do now, by the way, have a deep-seated distrust for their government and skepticism about what it is that Soviet or Russian leaders today say to them. So if the Russians say something, they generally will not initially believe it. They'll wait for some confirmation from somebody. Kennedy was admired by the Russians. So when he spoke, they wanted to hear what he's got to say. And it was terribly important because there were indications in advance that Kennedy had something of importance to say, but they didn't tip off the press as to exactly what it was. But my gut feeling, and I remember reporting this, was that the speech will be remembered if he is specific about steps that ought to be taken to ease the tension with the Russians. And when he said on his own, the United States of America, from now on, will no longer do atmospheric nuclear testing. Remember, one of the things that, I don't see anybody in this room who'd remember it, but in those days, people were terrified that the milk that you drank was already spoiled by the atmospheric testing. So every mother knew it, every father, the kids were frightened by it. And here was a great president saying, we're not going to do this anymore. So it had a big impact on Americans and a big impact on the Russians. The kind of pressure that Khrushchev would feel doesn't come in that society directly from the people. They have their way of speaking to one another. And he would get the word very quickly, probably from his son, who now teaches up at Brown, that his son was always tuned in. And his son would say, Papa, whatever he called him, this is something important and this is something you've got to do. And within a matter of just a couple of months, they reached the agreement and signed it.
They got it. Kennedy, according to Sorensen, thought it was his greatest achievement. What came out of this speech here? Talk about that.
No, I mean, I think it very much, I think the President viewed it, President Kennedy viewed it as one of, if not his greatest achievement, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which, in light of Ted's pacifism and support on once when I was helping him, I was rifling through his drawers, and I found a box, as I tended to do when I was looking for notes that he'd scribbled about the memoirs. And I found a box with Evelyn Lincoln's nice handwriting on it that said the president's pen from the Test Ban Treaty. And JFK gave him one of the pens as a gift.
That was October of '63, right before he was killed.
Yeah, and so I think all of these, the peaceful resolution of the missile crisis as well was something they were very proud of. And what they would talk about, and one of the things that Ted was very proud of, was the role that writing had actually played in the resolution of that crisis, and the response to Khrushchev's first letter, rather than the second.
Explain that.
Well, part of what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis was at the height of it, Khrushchev sent a letter to President Kennedy. And the letter was very emotional, it was very long. It seemed to have been written by Khrushchev himself, which was not typical of the communications that came from the Soviets. That letter was shortly followed by another letter, which was much more bureaucratic, much more belligerent, and seemed to bear the influence of some of Khrushchev's more militant military advisors. And so what Ted and Robert Kennedy came up with as an idea was, well, let's ignore the second letter, and let's respond to the first letter. And not only that, but they interpreted the first letter in a way that was advantageous to U.S. aims. So they reinterpreted certain and said, well, you said such and such. What we take that to mean is, and then they just filled in what they wanted to say. And so it was a very skillful letter that reflected the power of writing in resolving crises.
Hey, try that with a girlfriend. Look, or boyfriend. Let me just, you've had the expertise on that. Well, how big a role did Harriman and Llewellyn, who really took the speech here and then took it to the Soviet authorities and really put together that deal on the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and after the speech here? Those magic months, they had initials, I think, by August. They had the signature by October. But this was June. It was on a fast track.
It was on a fast track. I don't remember who the American negotiator was.
Harriman gets a lot of credit for it.
Well, maybe he's the one who did it. I don't remember that. What I do remember, and I think it's a point worth noting, we now take for granted in U.S.-Russian relations agreements like the START Treaty and agreements that limit huge weaponry. Well, it all started with the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty. Up until that time, we never even thought it was possible. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when both sides looked at that abyss of horror, they both pulled back and said to themselves, we've got to do something.
That's close. And why don't we, everybody jump into these. See, 2 mics here. We have about 10 or 15 minutes of active participation. If there's an argument, I'm in heaven. So,
Chris,
yes, Bob. Come on up and take positions here, and we'll have some interplay here.
I want to make,
if you dare. No.
I want to make one point about the interplay between Sorensen and Kennedy, which I actually learned from your book, believe it or not. You always worry about, any public person.
I'm glad I could be of help in a limited way.
It was, imperfectly, but it was good. You worry about whether did they actually write things themselves? And usually they haven't. I mean, people said about Newt Gingrich last year, he hasn't read any of the books he's written. Well, you quote a letter from JFK to his girlfriend from the Pacific, and when he's 26 years old. You should read it. Nobody wrote it for him. He typed it out on a manual typewriter. It is really terrific. It's incisive, it's concrete, there are all kinds of insights. He's surprisingly sympathetic to the Japanese, of all people, the people that tried to kill him. And it's his words. And it really, so what does that tell me as a speechwriter? A lot of times you're writing a speech and you might say, all right, that's a nice detail. Oh, my boss will never go for that. Or he won't appreciate that nuance, or he'll think that's weird. I think when Sorensen wrote something, he had the confidence that Kennedy really did have an appreciation of great language.
I think it's about ability to take pains. It's not about talent. I've been in the same chair. My wife hit me up. Kathleen Matthews used to be an anchor here. She hit me this morning. She said, you are going to wear that chair out. I've been in the same chair for the last year and a half. Whenever I'm not on television, I'm in that chair. And that's the difference between a writer and a wannabe writer. Jack Kennedy could write like this, but Sorensen could sit down and do it. That's the difference between students. That's the difference. Saying I'd like to write a novel someday and writing it. And sitting down in that chair, like I did for the Kennedy book, Nixon and Kennedy book, I spent 9 years on it. And I do write my books, verbatim. And I'll tell you, it's a difference between, well, I'm not going to go into guys who aren't like that. Let's go. Next question.
Yes, my name is Louis Salazar. I'm a freshman here at American. And Mr. Matthews, you mentioned being a political junkie at a young age. Well, I grew up watching you on Hardball, so thank you for that.
How old were you when you first started?
I was about really watching and understanding maybe 13, 14. Now I'm 19. So
we try to reach that demo. Actually, my demo is about 85. I mean, my best girlfriends, platonically speaking, are in their 80s. And, Sunshine and cable are both free, basically. We're available to people on limited budgets.
I'm a political science major now.
Well, you'll learn a lot because what you're getting access to. I always say to people, mix it up there. Don't trust one network. Don't just watch MS. Don't watch the series.
Watch
them all. Put it together. Read a good paper. Read a local paper. You have got to make your own stew today in journalism. You can't rely on Uncle Walter. There ain't no Uncle Walter. Maybe he wasn't. He was a liberal, but he's a straight reporter. But today, I think you got to mix it up. Put your stew together.
My question, and any of you can answer, how has the art and craft and really the power of writing evolved and actually become part of the conversation now for presidents?
Well, I mean, I'll take a crack at that. I mean, it is a lot harder for a president to communicate now than it was for Sorensen and JFK. The media environment has changed so dramatically in the past 40 years. The number of speeches a president gives, the ability to penetrate this media environment, actually reach people, is a daily challenge for a president. So this speech could be delivered, reported, conveyed to the American people through a straight line, or more or less, in a way that today it would be refracted through television, through blogs, through all kinds of stuff in a way that wasn't true back then.
How did it get through unfiltered? AP reporting, just straight, here's the speech, and somebody read the report on AP?
How do you get it today? Just by...
Well, it's live TV today, probably.
Yeah, live TV, read the text, but who takes a whole speech? I mean, you'd have to dig up the transcript or the speech text that's released from a press office. I mean, it's just very difficult to get it back. When President Kennedy was delivering speeches, the entire speech would be reprinted in papers for people to read, and it's just...
Absolutely.
Well, the great thing today on the other side is you can just Google and get the whole text right now.
Yeah.
Right now. Yes?
Hi there. Great discussion. Although I do hope next time you do an event like this that you bring in a female perspective, because there are female...
Who would you like to address that comment to? Not to the invitees, because the invitees were here unaware of the gender makeup.
Right.
But I do love to pass the buck. Who wants to take responsibility for an all-male casting?
Dottie does, yeah.
And you're here.
I am, and I actually work as a speechwriter in the administration. But I often hear that, Congress or the speeches coming out of Congress are written at like a ninth grade level or something like that. So I'm wondering if, have we sort of dumbed down our speeches? I mean, have we missed the heyday? Or
who do you read?
Who do I read personally?
Where did you get that judgment?
Well, no. I mean, I don't get that judgment. I mean,
well, whose judgment is it?
Well, you hear there's studies.
Who said it's the ninth grade level? Who said it to you?
It's one of those groups that studies the words coming out, and you think about all the 1-minute speeches that are
hearsay
on the floor.
It's
anyway.
hearsay.
No.
Anyway, let's respond to the hearsay. Somebody told her that somebody can't give a decent 10th grade speech. I mean,
No, she is right about that.
Is she right? Okay,
yeah, there was
You're
a study
source.
last year.
You're a source.
And, there's actually a professor at Wesleyan University in Connecticut who has taken the readability stats on a computer and run every inaugural from George Washington to George Bush. And he says, look, George Washington spoke at a 17th grade level. George Bush speaking in an 8th grade level.
Hey,
That's
George
terrible.
W.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Okay, all right, okay, that's not fair.
No.
That's not fair.
no, when a lot of Obama speeches are done at a 5th and 6th grade level too. You can
Adam
test it
Frankel
out.
for the defense.
Listen, one thing I'll say is if you read JFK speeches and then read and have the wherewithal to read Adlai Stevenson's speeches,
Oh, yeah.
what you will find is that Stevenson's speeches you might think are really erudite and but the truth is many of them are very talented writers, but they're fairly long-winded and
Who's better read,
professorial.
Kennedy or Stevenson?
Well, that's exactly right.
What's the answer?
Who's better read?
Yeah, who's read more in their life? Who
Well,
knows
of course,
more?
Kennedy.
Yeah, thank
well,
you.
But then, so
Didn't
that's
Stevenson write his own stuff?
that-
Stevenson wrote much of it. He had some great speech. Arthur Schlesinger,
Bartlett
John
Martin.
Bartlett Martin wrote.
Martin wrote a lot.
But the part of the point is that back then people would have said, well, Stevenson is a professorial. Kennedy is speaking to people much more clipped. It's fresh. It's new, you know. And so I think this is something that just happens is an ongoing debate throughout.
But you should go get, if you can get old 78s of Adlai Stevenson speeches, you'll be wowed. They were unbelievable. He had the voice of a Ronald Colman, if you know who that is, a great actor, almost British. His elocution was spectacular, and you felt so proud that he was the. There was once a line I read, I'm sure it's not true, but it's like hearsay, which are some of the best lines. General Eisenhower said, if I'd known the Democrats were going to run so fine a man, I wouldn't have ran against them. Stevenson was something. Anyway, you, sir.
Yes, I never thought I would get a chance to tell war stories in public. However, I was there. And I was a boot ensign in a Naval Security Group, which probably never heard of, but it's communication intelligence part of the Navy. And at that time, we had a network around the Atlantic which had receivers, antenna, which could pick up any radio signal. And the way it operated was based on the direction of the radio signal, you could triangulate where a ship was. And we were following the freighter that was carrying the missiles on its deck. A few days before, the White House was constant contact with us to find out where the freighter was or if it stopped. And the White House always wanted to know where the freighter, what the freighter was doing. It was a very tense time. Key personnel were evacuated to West Virginia, and it was very clear, to at least to me, that something really, really bad was going on. The terror was palpable, and it's just so ironic that I got to hear that brilliant speech of his sometime later and recognized the gravity of it.
Did you feel at the time when you were on duty that we might go to nuclear war?
Yes, yes. It was very clear that the ships had to stop, or else we were gonna sink it.
Marvin?
No, there are two quick points. If you're in Moscow at that time, two things. One, in a number of clear ways, Khrushchev was signaling that he wanted very much for this crisis to end peacefully. There was an American opera star named Jerome Hines who was singing at the Bolshoi on that Wednesday. I went to hear him, and unbeknownst to anybody, right in that central balcony area, Khrushchev and the entire Politburo arrives. To what? To listen to an American sing on the third day of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Come on, kids. He then went backstage to talk to Hines, shook hands with him, and he did not mind that I followed him in there, and he knew very well who I was. And he shook hands and he said, I hope we can get out of this problem. Let us have more Jerome Hineses. There was that kind of signaling going on. The Russian people were buying, this is a very interesting thing, when you have acute crisis in Russia, you cannot buy flour because that makes bread, and in an acute crisis you need bread more than anything else. But during the Cuban Missile Crisis, unlike the Berlin crisis of the summer before, you could go to a marketplace in Moscow and buy both salt and flour. And if you could do that, what the Russian people are saying is, we don't think there's going to be a big war. So you had the two worlds, really. The Americans thinking we're on the edge, and the Russian people thinking, no,
Oh, that was real bread over there, right?
It was real bread.
Wasn't the infinitely compressible kind that we have. Yes.
Thank you all for coming. I'm Parker Wishick. I'm a graduate student in the political communication program here. Y'all talked about the promise not to do atmospheric testing, and that was a big gamble. In today's world, in today's fact-checking age, it seems still kind of easy to make promises and then later break them. That was a huge promise. You know, it would have been huge then, and it's huge now. I wondered if y'all could talk a little bit about the repercussions of him having to go back on that promise. The concept of putting a promise like that into a speech, and then how that's evolved into today's political realm, I guess.
Yeah, that was a serious problem throughout the Kennedy administration. The question of testing or not to test, to give the Soviets a chance to stop. It was so tricky, and I think the only thing about the atmospheric, I think you knew that was that could be tested, that could be checked, and you could reliably test but verify. You could verify they weren't doing it right. It was the underground and that they were worried they couldn't stop.
And the underground did continue forever and a day, but the atmospheric stuff touched an emotional chord with the American people and with the Russians, so that when Kennedy did gamble, when he said that we will on our own stop atmospheric testing, but if the Russians then tested atmospherically, Kennedy would have every right and everyone would understand that we resume testing. He just about said that in the speech too. I don't remember the words here.
Marvin is right about the emotional content about that. There was a book then called On the Beach.
Yes.
Made into a movie. And at the end of the book, the radioactive cloud is spreading throughout the world, killing everybody. And I remember, God, they got that stuff in the air. I'm breathing it in. How dangerous is that?
Who was in that? Fred Astaire, right? Fred Astaire, ironically, yeah.
Was it really?
Yeah.
Was he in the movie? Yeah.
And I think Gregory Peck was in it too.
Gregory Peck, that's right. Yeah.
Movie. It was pretty grim.
Yes.
Who was in it? Ava Gardner's always.
It's great to have a film school here. It really is.
It's all in the movies. One more. Let's finish up, everybody. The three of you are standing, or the two of you are left standing. You, sir.
Thank you very much for being here tonight, gentlemen. My question is, Mr. Frankel, you brought up that this speech was seen by 3 or 4 people before it was read. I know if President Obama gave a speech like this without consulting everybody, in the administration, there'd be some serious flack. So I guess my questions are: how do you think President Kennedy was able to do this, and do you know, or could you infer if there were some inter-administration issues afterwards?
That's a good question. I don't know if there was any blowback from that. I mean, I think the scale of the federal bureaucracy was so much smaller then. The speechwriting staff for President Kennedy was primarily Ted. Dick Goodwin helped, Mike Feldman helped, and Arthur Schlesinger helped. But it was, I mean,
what did you have?
What's that? We have 8.
We had 5.
And it's been 8. It's been 7 or 8 for the past several administrations. And
they could use more.
Well, President Kennedy also was giving prepared remarks, a couple times a week, maybe prepared. He'd wing it. He'd go out and do his own thing. But the president is giving prepared remarks once a day, at least maybe. So, but I think there was a general sense that even despite that scaled back bureaucracy, that they didn't want to. They knew what they were saying was really controversial, and so they trust. They as I say, I think they shared it with the senior most. With the cabinet secretaries they trusted. McNamara is very close, and I think they shared it with Rusk and Mac Bundy and a few other key deputies. But they were just worried about letting the bureaucracy get their hands on it.
Wow. Any more? You okay?
Thank you.
One last.
Hello, my name is Chris Martin. I'm a graduate student here and I study journalism. Thank you for coming. My question is that today we hear a lot of pragmatic approaches to problems, and Kennedy was able to offer a grand solution to a big problem. And today, political rhetoric is much different because of the fast-paced environment. So how has that changed since the 1963 address, political rhetoric and offering solutions?
Back to Adam, I guess. And Robert, you wanted to.
It has changed a lot. And really, YouTube, the internet, makes so much stuff impossible that you can get away with then and not now. Now, if you make a mistake, back then, you could get away with it. Nobody would hear of it. Now, when Joe Biden said FDR got on TV to talk when the country was in trouble, that was on YouTube within 5 minutes, and it's still there now. So there's enormous pressure not to make mistakes, not to be cautious. You do an ad lib, you speak before a live mic, you don't know it's open, you get killed.
That's true. You know, the most memorable quotes from the last campaign, well, for the 08 campaign was Obama, the candidate, speaking to a wealthy crowd up on Nob Hill in San Francisco when he said those regular people have to cling to their guns and their religion. And that hurt him a lot because it was telling. It was what he was thinking.
What about they said this day would never come?
Which one?
There was some loftier.
That's right. They're loftier. But I'm talking about to make the point that you can't control it. And the 47% is probably going to be on the epitaph or the gravestone of Romney, because it's what he thought. And Gary Hart was talking to a gay group out in L.A. one time, making fun of all. He was so glad he wasn't in New Jersey with all their solid waste dumps. Well, it was a very aesthetic line. I'm sure the audience enjoyed it. But they heard it in Jersey. And my father was from Jersey, said he's making fun of my state. And so people, you cannot control the viral anymore. You're so right. And it all goes, and it's on your permanent record because somewhere it will always be.
But you know what's
everything you say now.
You know what's a good thing about the internet? If you go to the White House website, you can go into speeches and you can look up every single one of Adams' 300 speeches in entirety and probably watch them all and see every mistake that he's made.
It's true.
So you never get the drafts, though, right?
Never get the drafts. One other response to that, though, is that you know, now I think when the president gives a and there are occasions when a president will give a sort of bigger, thoughtful address, and I can think of a couple the president has given. A commencement he gave University of Michigan, where he laid out his vision on government, for example. You know, the press will, with all due respect, ask, well, what's new in the speech? Give me what's new? And otherwise, it's not covered that way. It's just these. So the president will often. This is an environment where the pace of things is so accelerated, where there are few opportunities really for a president to kind of step back and give that broader vision, because just on the course of a day you're responding to a lot of stuff. But even on those occasions where you can take a step back, it's hard to get covered in this environment.
Great. I came to Washington to be a speechwriter for a president like Ted Sorensen. That was my goal in life. So it's a very valid thing that you're teaching it here, this expertise. And Marvin Kalb, it's an honor to have you here. What a great night it's been. I hope this school never forgets what happened here in June of '63. You've got a wonderful bit of history right here to brag about. And I'm glad you're starting to do it. Thank you all.